All right, seniors, here we go. Book 4 of the Plague. Now, what we're going to deal with in this is what I believe. Now, this is arguable, okay? And there'll probably be a lot of people who will disagree. Maybe not you guys, but if, I was to speak to some other English teachers who taught this or some professors in a college, they may think I'm full of it. But I think that our climax occurs in this section, actually. I believe it's going to happen in section 3. And I'll tell you why when we get there. So there's something to look forward to. So let's start with section 1, though. We got to begin there. And what we get here is section 3 kind of set the table for, some time passage and that things were starting to get kind of bad in the town of Oran. So, the electricity just went out. Okay, well, it's back. So there's some things going wrong in the town of Oran. We knew that in section 3 as violence is starting to erupt and people are getting worse and worse. So we see that what's going on is that there is a fatigue basically setting in. Fatigue over the plague. People are tired of hearing about it. And doesn't that seem, relevant today as we're tired of hearing about coronavirus? People are fatigued of their situation. So, they're tired of their everyday, just humdrum, boring. There's nothing going on. It's just trying to stay alive existence. And then finally, and this is the sad one, it's fatigue over life in general. They're getting to the point where they're just like, it may not even be worth living anymore for some of these people. They're losing so much. But again, remember, they do have a slightly different situation than we do. They're dealing with a lot of their loved ones dying and then the inevitability of, like, if you catch this, you probably are going to die too. It's a little different than coronavirus, where even if we contract that, there's a good chance we still survive and may even not have any long-lasting impact. People seem to have lost hope in cure at this point. They just don't think it's going to happen. It's like it's got to go away or we're just all going to die. They still are going out and doing what they can, though, because if you give up that's when death sets in. And I don't mean literal death, although that's probably part of it too, but definitely a sense of a figurative death. You lose everything that you have been holding on to. So we reconnect with some of our main characters here too, because none of them showed up in book 3. So Gron is particularly overworked. Remember, he's the weakest and probably the oldest of this crew. So he's definitely doing everything he can, because we just talked about how people are still going out and doing what they can, and Gron is one of those people. Ryu is checking in there. We see him again. His wife, we get some bad news about. She's still alive, but she's not doing well, according to her doctors. But of course, he can't really do anything about that. He just has to continue on with his job. Teru, his writing is starting to lose some spice. We see this guy also is starting to fade a little bit. And all he really seems interested in writing about is Katard right now, who is just he's acting funny. It's the plague is getting worse. Everyone in town is wilting, and Katard is acting like he's, just the happiest he's ever been in his life. It's so stinking weird. The man is nuts. He really is. Okay. So let me read a couple of passages to you. We go to page 192 and we get a little bit of discussion about the exhaustion, how fatigue is impacting these people. We're going to start with Ryu. It says, no resource was left him but to tighten the stranglehold on his feelings and harden his heart protectively, for he knew that this was the only way of carrying on. In any case, he had a few illusions left, and fatigue was robbing him of even these remaining few. He knew that over a period whose end he could not glimpse, his task was no longer to cure, but to diagnose, to detect, to see, to describe, to register, and then condemn. That was his present function. So the good part of being a doctor, the helping people, he's not even getting to do now. Now he's basically there to find the people who have the plague and isolate them and quarantine their families. You don't want to see this guy coming because, bad news is going to follow. So really not a good situation. Then continuing on to the next page, it said it wasn't medical aid that he dispensed in those crowded days, only information. Skipping a little, he says, had he been less tired, his senses more alert, that all-pervading odor of death might have made him sentimental. But when a man has had only 4 hours of sleep, he isn't sentimental. He sees things as they are. That is to say, he sees them in the garish light of justice, hideous, witless justice. Again, skipping a little. It says, before the plague, he was welcomed as a savior. He was going to make them right with a couple of pills or an injection, and people took him by the arm on his way to the sick room. Flattering, but dangerous. Now, on the contrary, he came accompanied by soldiers, and they had to hammer on the door with rifle butts before the family would open it. Look at how his job has changed, and this is really what hurts him. And you got to think this is happening. My wife's a nurse, and she could tell us about how it's happening where they are, where it's not that they're becoming like that, but it's like your job was in surgery, and now your job is to try to take care of the coronavirus patients, which is not really what she had trained for. And while she's not having to care for them, some of her friends are, and it's just and it's very difficult. My wife also worked on the cancer ward for a while, and to see people suffering with this, and while some get over it, a lot of them don't, and it wears on you. So Ryu's missing out on the good parts of being a doctor and getting to become something he never intended to be. Um, Exhaustion's also making all of these people more prone to sickness, the people in town and our main characters. Excuse me, I have to sip coffee a little bit here. It's the end of the day. I'm winding down. All right. So we know that them going out and working could, because they're exhausted and because that makes them more susceptible, going out and working every day is a gamble. But, and this is one of the messages that Camus is giving us. So do you just give up? Is that the answer? And of course it's not. When you give up, like I said earlier, you're admitting that you've been beaten. And really, one of the things we have to learn is that that's not an acceptable option. Giving up is just not something you do. All right. The only person who's really thriving at this point is Cotard, which we already talked about. And just there's a lot of passages about him in this section. It says, here we are talking about Cotard. He says he's blossoming out, expanding in geniality and good humor. For Cotard was anything but upset by the turn events were taking. Getting worse every day, isn't it? Well, anyway, everybody's in the same boat. Now, that's the key to Cotard's happiness, is that everyone is in the same boat. He is a man who loathes loneliness. And he felt like for a while he's on an island by himself. And he's terrified of going to jail and being alone. So now everyone's miserable, and that makes him happy. And that's not a good thing, like I said. A little more about him. It said, he's in the same peril of death as everyone else, but that's just the point. He is in it with the others. He has got the idea into his head, apparently, and perhaps it's not so far-fetched as it seems, that a man suffering from a dangerous ailment or grave anxiety is allergic to other ailments and anxieties. He was under the impression that, somehow this insulates him from everything else. So the thing he'd most detest is being cut off from others. He'd rather be one of the beleaguered crowd than a prisoner alone. All right. So again, we get the idea that for this guy, being part of a group is what he thrives on. And he's part of a group now. I mean, he's part of the people dying of plague. Now, he hasn't contracted it, but I mean, just in a general. Okay. It's odd for him to be happy in a plague setting. There's a little more about him here. It says, of alone, he is happily at one with all around him, with their superstitions, their groundless panics, the susceptibilities of people whose nerves are always on the stretch, with their fixed idea of talking the least possible about plague and nevertheless talking of it all the time, with their abject terror at the slightest headache. Now they know headache to be an early symptom of the disease. And lastly, with their frayed, irritable sensibility that takes offense at trifling oversights and brings tears to their eyes over the loss of a trouser button. Again, we see more of the same, to be honest with you, that Cotard feels like he's part of the group. He's oddly happy in a plague setting. Another thing we see as we move on past Cotard is we see that the people in town are now doing something kind of odd. And I don't know if we can really make a relevant relation to today, but I think you can if you stretch it. They say that prices on the necessities are soaring in town. Remember, they're running out of things. But it says now people are just splurging on luxuries, things they don't need. So why are they doing that? Well, there's nothing else to buy. And to be honest with you, they may be dying. So why not enjoy your last little hurrah is kind of the thinking there. Again, I don't think we quite hit that here. I do notice that, me personally, as we got deeper into the quarantine part of, when we hit the, May, June, July section of this, I had been hoarding money up until then. I wasn't spending it on anything because I wanted to be sure that if something happened, we had some. But at that point, I started, I went out and bought a ton of records because, I'd been saving up money. And I was like, hey, I got some extra. And I started to kind of splurge. So I do think there's a little bit of that. I think that's what we call retail therapy. The idea that going and buying some things that you want, that you can enjoy, helps you feel better for even if it's just a few minutes. I think we see that happening here. Finally, or not finally, but in the closing a little bit here, we see that the plague is also building a sense of mistrust among people, which again makes Cotard feel better. Because it says it's common knowledge that you can't trust your neighbor. He may pass the disease to you without your knowing it and take advantage of a moment of inadvertence on your part to infect you. When one has spent one's days, as Cotard has, seeing a possible police spy in everyone, even in persons he feels drawn to, it's easy to understand this reaction. One can have fellow feelings towards people who are haunted by the idea that when they least expect it, plague may lay its cold hand on their shoulders, and is perhaps about to do so at this very moment when one is congratulating oneself on being safe and sound. Just because he has been through it before them, he can't wholly share it with them, the agony of this feeling of uncertainty that never leaves them. It comes to this. Like all of us who have not yet died of plague, he fully realizes that his freedom and his life may be snatched from him at any moment. But since he personally has learned what it is to live in a state of constant fear, he finds it normal that others should come to know this state. Fear seems to him more bearable under these conditions than it was when he had to bear his burden alone. So again, we're talking about Qatar. We're back to him. And his idea is that the fear that everyone's feeling, he's been fearing for a while, and now he doesn't feel alone. All right, and that's sad and disturbing at the same time. The section ends with a really disturbing scene. We have who are our two? Taru and Qatar go to see a play that's being presented because there was a play group that was stuck in town because they weren't allowed to leave. But they got locked in just like Rambert did. And so they've been putting on pretty much the same play night after night after night. Well, tonight, one of the actors who is sick with plague apparently gets up on stage, and when he's acting, he ends up dying in front of the crowd. Now, that seems really disturbing. And why is that detail in here? Because it just goes to show that plague has become so normal for these people that they're just going on with their daily lives. What else can they do at this point? And so that ends section one. So we see we're starting to get our characters back. We were missing them in book three. So book four, section one, we start to get them back. And then we move into section two. Section two is probably the shortest of the three that we'll talk about. Really, it comes down to, it's about Rambert, who is now, he's still waiting for his chance to escape. But oddly enough, he had volunteered way back in book two that he would help with the sanitation crews, and he's throwing himself into it fully. I mean, he has found something to care about, which he needed. So he's really going at it. We find out that the local magistrate, Othon, who we're going to see again in section three, has kind of noticed that Rambert has something to do with Cotard and the other smugglers. And because he's friends with Ryu, he kind of gives him a heads up. And he's like, hey, man, you need to tell your friend to watch himself. So at this point, Rambert goes out of his way to go speak. He's become friends with Ryu, and he really respects him. He goes and asks him, he's like, why aren't you trying to stop me from leaving if you know this is bad? And Ryu reminds him that each person has to find their own way. It's not his place to stand in the way of whatever happiness this man can find. If escaping and being with this girl he loves is his way to happiness, then he wants him to be happy. So again, Ryu's a really neat guy in that, he's not worried about what he wants or what he thinks is right. Like, we're always so hung up on I'm right all the time and no one else is, and you should do what I think. Ryu's like, look, I want you to be happy, and your happiness lies down a different path than mine. So I want to help you in any way possible for you to personally be happy. Ryu is an exceptionally noble character. This really confuses Rambert, and that's going to pay off here in just a minute. So Taru is also, we see him again. He's getting very much so weaker, and that's going to be an important detail. It's not really fleshed out yet, but understand that's important. And then we pass a little bit of time, and Rambert is about to leave. He's supposed to leave at midnight of whatever night this occurs on, but he wants to go meet with Ryu one last time. He really is dead set on hunting this man down. He'll do anything what he needs to do. When he finally is able to catch up with him, he tells him that Rambert is not going to leave town. He wants to stay with Dr. Ryu and help him. He wants to stay and do what needs to be done for the good of the community, not his own personal desires. He realizes, and this is an important detail, and some of you are going to argue with this, and that's totally fine. Okay, I want to pull my best Dr. Ryu here and say, you have to make your own choices. But for me, when I read this and it really clicked for me, it kind of altered the way I think a little bit. He points out that our personal happiness should not be the end goal, and this is what Rambert's thinking. It should be about doing the most good we can, and even if it comes at a cost. And for Rambert, that means giving up the girl, and perhaps for good, and staying in the town and risking his own health because he knows he can do more good there. And that, to me, is a huge step for him, and I feel like that's an important detail. And it's a really feel-good moment in the book because we're about to get blasted in section 3 with a really, really bad one. All right? Let me see if I can find 209. Here we go. Let me read this section about Rambert because the wording is beautiful. Because until now, I always felt a stranger in this town and that I had no concern with you people. But now that I've seen what I have seen, I know that I belong here, whether I want it to or not. This business is everybody's business. So that's the attitude we should take. And I know you guys get tired of hearing me rant about this, whether it's on videos or in class, but we've got to learn to take things as a group and not so much as about this is me, this is my stuff, this is my world. We are to be a community, and that is what Rambert realizes. Even though he's not from there, he's like, I've grown to love you people, and I'm going to do what I can for you. And that right there, guys, even if for a story that has guys that are not believers, they sure seem to get some of the gist of it, because that's something that we as believers are not good at, and we need to get better at. All right, section 3. This is where I think we see a climax happen. I'll explain why when we get to it. First off, we get that a new, they call it a serum, treat it like it's a vaccine. It's not a vaccine for the plague, but the word we would use today, serum would still be right, but it's some sort of medicine. But I thought vaccine would work well for you guys. It's introduced. They finally have got something in there. This is the last hope for this town, to be honest with you. At this point, the magistrate, Othon, his son, his young son, I don't know if we get an age or not, but he's young, contracts the plague. And Othon is, Teru said Othon's like enemy number one. I don't know if I agree. Othon has some elements of him that I like. And this is one of them. Othon's like, okay, well, I'm not special. We have to follow the law, which means my son has to be taken to the hospital. My wife and I have to quarantine. And the fact is, they basically need to say goodbye to their son, because if he doesn't survive, they're never going to see him again. And they both have to go to a quarantine where they don't even get to be with each other. But he could pull strings here and change things, but he says, I'm going to follow the law because it's what's good for everyone, which I respect that. I really do, because that's not the way most of us react. All right. So at this point, Othon keeps focusing on how the rules are the same for all, so that when he's even told, we don't have a good place to put you. You're going to have to go to this awful camp out on the outskirts. And he's like, that's fine. That's what's expected. I will follow the laws that I've put in place. Which I love that. There's so many times you see, people in power, say put in a law for everyone else, but they seem to think they don't have to abide by it. And that makes it where it's harder to follow those people. But when you see people like this, if I had an issue with Othon and I saw him saying this, I would be like, maybe I misjudged this guy. All right. The description of Othon's son suffering, and I am not going to read this. This you need to read on your own. It is traumatizing. It really is. It represents some really amazing writing. It shows that Camus has the ability to capture an emotion and to really be heart wrenching. Because to think this little child suffering the way he does is just not okay. At this point, they make a realization. The doctor and the people that are there with him, they make a realization that is really disturbing, but it puts you in a bad situation. They realize that giving the child the medicine, and he's one of their test subjects for it. Giving him the medicine, it could make him better. If it doesn't and he still dies, it's going to prolong his suffering. So now you're in a really bad pickle. It's like, do we give this kid the medicine, hoping to save him, because otherwise he's going to die? But then if we give him the medicine, it might extend his suffering and he's still going to die. So what do we possibly do? And sadly, the child eventually does die after suffering a lot. This greatly impacts our main characters, which is why I think this is the climax. Our characters are not the same after this. Okay, there's a big change at this point. Novice writers or readers tend to put a climax much later than they should, especially in literature. So this, I think, is the climax moment, because it's going to spark the next speech by Father Paneloux, which I think is going to be one of our major points. You can maybe argue that speech is your climax. I could probably get behind that, but I kind of think this is it, because I look for in novels like this, where is something that changes the direction of your main characters, and this is that spot. All right, Paneloux definitely struggles, and this is one of the things that makes Paneloux such a human figure, in my opinion, because no one could sit there and watch a child die, an innocent child die, and not feel something about it. In fact, Paneloux says. Actually, this is Ryu. Is it? Yeah, it's Ryu. He says that child anyhow was innocent, and you know it as well as I do. So Paneloux's trying to say the right thing. He's struggling. Says weariness is a kind of madness. This is Ryu talking, and there are times when the only feeling I have is one of mad revolt. I understand, Paneloux said in a low voice. That sort of thing is revolting because it passes our human understanding. But perhaps we should love what we cannot understand. And then Ryu says, no, Father, I have a very different idea of love. And until my dying day, I shall refuse to love a scheme of things in which children are put to torture. A shade of disquietude crossed the priest's face. Ah, doctor, he said sadly, I've just realized what it is meant by grace. And it's this whole thing where Ryu's upset. He's finally hit his breaking point. He's like, this is it. I'm done. I don't know what else to do. And Panalu's trying to hold on because Panalu is a person of faith. And when your faith is tested, if you just run away the first time it's tested, what have you got? So he's trying to hold on, but watching children die of something has got to be rough on him too. And we're going to see as he has this conversation, you guys can look at it. It's the last page of section 3. But this him having this discussion with Panalu, with Ryu, really, he struggles with it. But then we get this really neat passage, and this is again one of the climactic moments for me. Ryu makes the connection, and that they're similar. It says salvation. Well, let's see. He says Panalu sat down beside Ryu. It was obvious that he was deeply moved. Yes, yes, he said. You too are working for a man's salvation. Ryu tried to smile. Salvation's much too big a word for me. I don't aim so high. I'm concerned with man's health, and for me, his health comes first. Panalu keeps talking. Then at the end, he says, what I hate is death and disease, as you well know. And whether you wish or not, we're allies, facing them and fighting them together. Ryu is still holding Panalu's hand. So you see, but he refrained from meeting the priest's eyes. God himself can't part us now. So at that point, we see these two guys, and it's not Ryu. It's not Panalu talking. It's Ryu talking, saying we're the same in a lot of ways. We're both fighting for the same thing, and that's to help people get better. And guys, this is the point in the book where we're going to see them fighting a little harder, and that fatigue that was setting in at the beginning, we're going to see them fighting it and trying to do more. Right? So that ends this section. It's a little better than the last one, I think. I think at least we're getting some movement in plot. And, with the climactic moment, as sad as it was, that kind of pushes some action on us. And we're going to start seeing some real development in the next few sections. So I hope you guys learned something here. I hope it was useful. And I hope to see you again for the next section.